Welcome to YogiViews, where my guest is yoga itself, through interviewing those who practice it, teach it, sell it, or simply love it. I am Antonio Sausys. The ancient yogis, mostly using a technique called Atma Vichara or self-inquiry, were able to tap into the subtle connections between our psyche and yoga practice. As yoga came to the West, this connection became the subject of more study and deep analysis. As a result, the knowledge of the ancient yogis was proved to be valid, and new pieces of information emerged. To speak about this fascinating topic, I invited Mariana Caplan to join us today. Welcome, Mariana.
Thank you.
Mariana Caplan is a licensed psychotherapist, professor of yogic and transpersonal psychologies. She has spent 20 years researching cutting-edge and controversial topics in Western spirituality and dialoguing with the great spiritual teachers, scholars, and luminaries of our time. She uses somatic psychotherapy to support spiritual practitioners and teachers with the process of healing trauma and moving towards psychospiritual integration. Working with complex discernments that arise in the context of spiritual practice and in spiritual communities is part of her work as well. She is an adjunct professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies and has a degree in cultural anthropology, in counseling psychology, and in contemporary spirituality. She has written several books, amongst them Eyes Wide Open, Cultivating Discernment on the Spiritual Path, The Guru Questions, The Perils and Rewards of Choosing a Spiritual Teacher, and Halfway Up the Mountain, The Error of Premature Claims to Enlightenment. Mariana, there's this one question that all our viewers really appreciate knowing about, and that is, how did your personal yoga path start?
Well, I want to say as we begin that I really love that your guest is yoga. It's the thing that brings together everyone who's viewing and you and I. It's so wonderful to be together in the context of something larger.
Yeah.
So I came into contact with yoga by meeting a great yogi. So I was several years into my spiritual quest. I had been in Central America chasing shamans and doing whatever I could get my teenage hands on. And as I was wandering around India on a one-way ticket, I was 25 years old, I ran into a great yogi whom very few people like that exist ever, and certainly these days. His name was Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar, and he lived in the village of Tiruvannamalai, South India. Many people know Tiruvannamalai for the sage Ramana Maharshi and the great mountain, Mount Arunachala. And I was almost too young to appreciate or know what I was encountering, but just old enough to take in the impression. I spent about a year with him as a young woman, very close to him, and he didn't teach Hatha yoga. He didn't do very many formal teachings, but when we talk about being the guest of yoga itself, he really was yoga. Who he was inside and out took the bar of yoga so high that there was no ceiling and no bottom and no outside and no inside, and he did it in very non-linear ways. But the good fortune of encountering him as such a young woman was that the impression of the possibilities of where all of this could go was opened in a way, not that I could perceive how vast it was, but that I at least knew for the rest of my life that I could journey and journey and journey and never find the bottom, nor would we want to, because there's no end. And that much was clear. And Hatha yoga came in many years later. I had lived in ashrams and done a lot with meditation, and I was in the midst of a 3-year undiagnosable chronic fatigue type of illness, and really potentially dying. And I had gone to yoga classes, but I had never encountered the teacher who had the the spiritual foundation. Her name is Bhavani Maki. She is actually a student of Ramajoti Vernon, who is a guest of yours. And
a great mentor of mine as well.
Oh, wonderful. And practicing Hatha Yoga in the context of the sutras, of the Yoga Sutras, and being taught with the context of it woven in, it lit it up in my body. And I progressively over the next year healed my whole body and came into actually a much greater well-being than I'd started. And so I'm lifelong indebted to our Mother Yoga and have really been hanging out with it, teaching it, practicing it, loving it. I would like to say loving and hating it, but really not. I just love it. I just love it ever since.
Yeah, well. Now, in your particular case, you had grown to develop a system or a technique or deep study in the field of yoga and psychology. Mm-hmm. How did this particularly happen in your life, in your experience? How did these two universes come together in you?
I think I kept cycling between the two until I realized I couldn't live without either, because I was an adventurous young traveler. So I'd go hang out with my alcoholic shamans and then get a bunch of knowledge and realize that there was something psychologically impaired about the situation. Or I'd end up in these spiritual dramas. So then I went to grad school and got my master's in counseling and went very deep into psychology. And no sooner had I finished that, and I was off to India and meeting the yogis. And after spending 6 years living in ashrams and very austere spiritual practice, I couldn't help but to feel that there was actually a limitation in what even great spiritual teachings with great spiritual teachers were. There was a limitation in what I could access, and I intuitively felt that it was psychological in nature, that it wasn't a fault of the path, and it wasn't even an incomplete path. It was a path created in the East. And I was a young woman who had grown up, in a fiery and dramatic past, and So I just kept dancing between the two when somewhere along the way, and I would say ever more progressively, I couldn't see them as separate. And I knew that there was a marriage. So my psychotherapy practice became deeply informed by spirituality, and my experience of the spiritual path needed psychology. So of course we teach what we need to learn, so I began to research and write, and then in the last several years, and in the last year more than ever, I've just been committed to articulating. I've known this marriage, I've felt it, I've brought it forth in clients, but I wanted to articulate it. So now I've started in a series of projects, not to get to the end, but to lay out one more piece of the puzzle so that people can keep furthering it.
So now, aside from your personal experience, tell us about this marriage. How do these two marry? How is it that psychology and yoga interact?
Okay. And I should clarify that when we talk about psychology, I'm very well aware that Western psychology is a young tradition. It's really just over 100 years old, and the yoga tradition is, everyone has their number, but 5,000 plus years old. So I'm well aware that when I talk about psychology, it's not the psychology that's necessarily happening in mainstream psychology, but it is a psychology that is in the becoming. It's in the works, and there's great pioneers, neuroscientists, somatic psychologists, transpersonal psychologists.
Now, if you don't mind, before you tell us about the actual marriage, because not a lot of people know what somatic psychotherapy is.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that.
So there's a number of newer but grounded and non-flaky developments in psychology in the last 30 or 40 years. And the somatic basically is body-centered. So it's a body-centered approach to psychology. And unlike psychologies that are strictly about analysis and trying to understand and what happened in my past, that's an aspect of psychology. It's often an earlier aspect in the psychology that I'm interested in, really understanding and articulating the stories and releasing the shame and all of these things.
And it can be associated with what people know as talk therapy. Correct. Okay.
So when therapy drops into the body, and when we access what in Ashtanga, where I was trained, we invoked a deity called Jungli Kayamane, who's the inner physician. And it's the principle that every person has an inner physician. We may not know what it is or how to listen to it or how to work with it, but it's there. I mean, that's what got me into yoga, and I was going to heal my body. I thought I've heard about it, I must have one too, I'll be damned if I don't find it. And so there's an inner physician, and so when we take psychology into the body, it's like the entire body has the possibility of becoming conscious. And instead of, I often think of traditional psychotherapy as psychotherapy from the outside in. You have an insight and you try to change behaviors, you hope something rearranges inside. But when we work from the body, it's very similar to yoga in that way. You take it right here in the body, and you can work from the inside out. You let the body reveal the stories. You let the body unlock the traumas and contractions, and we listen. So we have this great tool that really changes the game. I did psychotherapy as a therapist for about 10 years without knowing this work and not being trained, and the last 10 years with it. And the results itself, they speak to its potency.
And so you are mentioning the body as a tool, as a diagnostic tool. I understand it is also a field of operation. So not only you can derive the information, but when you want to operate these changes, you use the body as well.
Yeah, and you, right, and when you say that, it's very powerful, because using the body means that the body can experience the transformation.
Correct.
The body gets to be the flourishing. And of course, like that's what we have, right? That's what we have. That's what all of consciousness is operating through. So I very much approach life and yoga from a more tantric approach, and I don't resonate. I did at certain points in my life, but I don't resonate with yogic approaches that ask us to leave things behind or transcend or get off the wheel. Me and my girlfriend at the ashram, we used to hide away and have our taboo conversation, and she'd say, I don't want to get off the wheel, I like being alive. And I said, I like being alive too. And what's wrong with wanting to relate and have sex and enjoy nice clothes and wrestle with the hard stuff? And we were having this little, what we thought was a hidden conversation, and as we continue our study, we find that there's many and deep and profound approaches that allow us to include all of life and to make use of everything for a transformational possibility. And that's where I get excited.
And what about transpersonal psychology? Just a brief.
Yeah.
Because I understand these are your two main roots, or yeah.
Yeah. So what transpersonal psychology does, if we consider psychology traditionally as the study of the mind and our history and our stories and our conditionings and patterning, transpersonal psychology takes that and this mind, and it places it in the context of consciousness. So then we have not only that, but it's in the context of our full spectrum of development, from the most gritty, neurotic, contracted places into our full human possibility. So when you place psychology into the context of consciousness, and there we're into the yogic territory, from what does the mind arise? From what does thoughts and identity arise? So it really blasts open psychology and just places it in the context of a much larger playing field. And much less important for me is the techniques and the wording, and much more important is really the context of the therapist or the teacher or the person who's holding the space for transformation.
This is why the placebo effect is real.
Yeah.
Because you can actually use any technique or give a person any pill, and it might have the same effect. So how do they relate with yoga?
I think that yoga and the Eastern traditions are exceptionally brilliant in articulating the the structures of consciousness. These traditions, whether it's yoga or Buddhism or Sufism, there's these wonderful detailed maps and methods for perceiving, actually getting to experience, for articulating, studying depths of consciousness that of course we never would have heard of growing up. And there's maps. There's a right in the domain of broader consciousness. Nothing replaces it for the transcendent part of life, for the way that you or I could, with the right guidance and diligence and consistent practice, sit here and somehow experience the universe inside of our body, or between us, or many, many, many great things. So the yogic covers the really the context of consciousness from what everything arises, and if we stick with it in a lifelong way with diligence, as the sutras teach us, knowledge will arise. However, we can do that for decades and still be the same neurotic, confused, anxious, depressed, relationally impaired, and even unkind, poorly parenting individuals that we were before all of that, because the yoga, it touches that in different ways, but really good Western and somatic psychology, that's the Western, because it respects the mind and it doesn't say it's unreal, and the person, it's not so concerned with the person being unreal and everything being an illusion. It says, like, okay, let's get in there. And over these 100+ years, a lot has been learned, and I think that there's practices and techniques and research and new developments in psychology, and it was particularly understood for the Westerner, so that actually are more effective than some of the yogic technology. And also relational practices, because many of our wounds occurred in relationship, and then we expect to heal them by sitting alone with our eyes closed in meditation, or sweating and shaking in yoga. But a lot of that healing actually comes in relationship. But one more piece here of how I start to see them really deeply in relationship is that you can start anywhere in the equation. Let's say I am working with some anxiety, and I'm approaching you as my yoga therapist or my psychotherapist, and you have this context of consciousness, and as I work with this particular repetitive patterns, and they're pointed out, because of where you're sitting from your practice, I start as a client to realize, oh, that's actually like a conditioned arising that comes by itself. It's actually not me. I experience it, but it's really not me. I'm so much more than that. And I gain that confidence from, which is really the spiritual perspective. And then when we return and go into that from this confidence, like it's in me, but it's not me. And I might want to approach it, lovingly even, because it's a conditioning, and it has a karma and an ancestry. And we have this spaciousness and ideally even love. So the next spiral that we circle in, we can penetrate more deeply. We can unlock a lot more with love and spaciousness and awareness and the things we learn through yoga. And then the beautiful thing is when we unlock these binds, it can free us up to much deeper experiences of consciousness. Many people are blocked in meditation because they had some kind of traumatic experience as a child where they felt like they were falling, or it was all kind of black and scary. So they go into meditation, and the first thing that happens is anxiety. And we may not even get into silence because something about silence had been scary. So you open up some of these knots, and then you return to the spiritual practices, and they go much, much deeper. And then with that depth, we penetrate into the psyche more deeply, and they really start, I often kind of see that infinity sign, but they really start to blend together so seamlessly that when it's very, very classic argument in spiritual traditions, or a classic, I think, narrow perspective that psychology is just the domain of the ego and it's narcissism and we can get lost indefinitely. And I think that's when it...
Well, we have one. We have one ego.
Yeah, yeah.
We are it also, aren't we?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with ego. Not at all. I think it can be a great thing when well attended to.
Mariana, you created a technique, yoga and psyche. Tell us about this technique or how it relates to the concepts you're sharing with us.
Yeah. Well, for me, yoga really unlocked, physical hatha yoga unlocked the inner healer. And I had the time and space in that part of my life because I couldn't do anything else to really get inside the body, and I was psychologically trained, so I was able to sort out and unwind a lot of things in myself. But after that, I got so inspired that I undertook a 3-year training in a method called somatic experiencing that was articulated by a man named Peter Levine. And it was a very rigorous program. I had my therapy license, I had my doctorate, but I thought there's something to be learned here. So I went through this rigorous program, but in my mind, it's really about trauma. But in my mind, I was approaching all of it with this context of yoga. And to get certified in this method, we had to do a lot of sessions of supervision where somebody would help us and supervise us. So what I was doing in those years, I was really interested in how these things would work together. So I would come up with these ideas, and then I would have my trainers try them on from their expertise. So I got a lot of help in figuring out how these two blend together. So it's a longer subject, but I think one of the great things that I learned from my somatic training is that the knots of consciousness and the traumas and the deep places within us that are contracted, whether they're real or not real, ultimately almost is irrelevant. But those things are actually best approached in small doses with gentleness and love. May make sense, but a lot of us hardcore yogis, we went the path of power and breaking through, and if there's something I have to see, put me in a cave for 24 hours and I'll burst through it and feel the center of it. And it took me many years to be willing. This approach actually, when you're hitting a trauma or a difficult place, you're actually going into the top 2 or 3% of it for 15 or 20 seconds at a time. And you're only doing that when you've invoked great love in your body. So you're actually approaching the contractions with gentleness and love, and you're touching in and you're touching out, and there's immense amounts of things to be learned from that. Like, if I am willing to go to this place inside of me, I will not get overwhelmed. I have the capacity to go in, and I have the capacity to come out. And whole lives, chunks of lives are lost, or parts of lives, like the parts that want to have relationships or harmony with people, or want to be vulnerable,
or
and
success.
Success, intimacy, by not being able, willing, knowing how to feel feelings, and unbelievably, some of these huge stuck patterns, when we're willing to feel part of it, when we're able to position ourselves where we can feel even 1 minute, and you repeat that 1 minute, a few hundred times, but it's only a minute, and lifetime patterns start to unlock. So I then started taking that into the actual asanas itself, and learning how to make distinctions between physical strain and emotional strain, and when we feel the emotional strain, how to back out of the asanas to a certain degree to have enough space to explore the psychological content, so that we can, these hard yoga poses that we've avoided for years, you can actually go in with this method very lovingly and gently, and unpack the images and emotions in a very, very gentle way, so that when you're doing your asana practice, you can actually learn to do a great amount of free psychotherapy on yourself while you're having your spiritual training. And these days nobody has enough time, so if you can do your therapy and yoga and get your exercise and not compromise anything, we're in great shape.
You were at some point saying that you're not that concerned with what technique. I would assume, therefore, you're not that concerned with what particular asana, or on the contrary, do you use specific asanas to unlock or unblock or understand or explore particular psychic contents?
I personally haven't directly associated specific asanas with specific emotions. I know that there's correlations, and there's actually people, I think, with more knowledge than myself on that. But because I'm so committed to Jungli Kaimane, or the inner healer, I watch the person knowing what they need. If only we figure out how to access it, and they begin to learn how to listen to it and have confidence. So I like to experiment with poses for people that just make this little right? Simple poses, we might do them all the time. Warrior two, something inside of us. So to ask people to find the poses that they're a little afraid of, but then also to experiment with the poses that are more spacious, because when we don't have to work with the contractions, then we have another possibility. Because we're not just trying to fix our problems, right? We're trying to become who we can possibly be. So sometimes going deeply into that which is already whole and healed provides an unknown expansion there.
And perhaps a sort of map, as you were naming today.
Yeah, and this is also the beauty. You're asking about transpersonal psychology. One of the predecessors was an Italian psychiatrist called Roberto Assagioli, and he said that a complete psychology would not only deal with that which is broken or neurotic, but actually would assist individuals with all the progressive levels of the awakening of consciousness and the pathologies that come with this progressive awakening. So it's a real full spectrum treatment, which of course yoga knew about from the beginning. But we as Westerners in this context are often benefited by techniques and practices that were developed for us, rather than, a bunch of Indian guys.
Yeah. This concludes the first part of a two-part show where I'm interviewing Mariana Caplan. She is a licensed psychotherapist, professor of yogic and transpersonal psychologies. She has spent 20 years researching cutting-edge and controversial topics in Western spirituality and dialoguing with the great spiritual teachers, scholars, and luminaries of our time. She uses somatic psychotherapy to support spiritual practitioners and teachers with the process of healing trauma and moving towards psychospiritual integration, and working with the complex discernments that arise in the context of spiritual practice and in spiritual communities. She is an adjunct professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies and has degrees in cultural anthropology, counseling psychology, and contemporary spirituality. She has written several books, amongst them Eyes Wide Open, Cultivating Discernment on the Spiritual Path, The Guru Questions, The Perils and Rewards of Choosing a Spiritual Teacher, and Halfway Up the Mountain, The Error of Premature Claims to Enlightenment. I hope you like our show today. If you care to let me know, shoot me an email at antonio@yogiviews.com. I look forward to seeing you the next time.